right, ladies and gentlemen. So, last class, we started our discussion of bureaucracy. So remember, we covered the idea of what a bureaucrat is, why people have concerns about bureaucracy, what our legitimate concerns are, what our kind of unfounded concerns are. Then we worked through the structure. We talked about the fact that we have cabinet, we have the executive office of the president, we have those independent agencies. I suggested that you have different examples of the different kinds. What I want to revisit today, make sure that we really fully complete, is this idea of discretion. What does bureaucratic discretion exactly mean? If you look on the back of your graphic organizer, I think it's question 4. Jack, will you read me question 4? What does it say?
What ways is the bureaucracy quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial?
Okay, so that's kind of a funny phrase, right? In what ways is a bureaucracy quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial? So when you use that phrase quasi, we mean kind of. So even though the bureaucracy is enforcing the law, okay, technically that's all they are, is they are law enforcers. In what ways are they kind of like lawmakers, and in what ways are they kind of like judges? Your textbook uses different language. I like the quasi better. Your textbook calls it, for quasi-legislative, they call it administrative discretion. So you might want to put that word down too, because it means the same thing. So quasi-legislative is like administrative discretion. And quasi-judicial, they call it, here's a big one, administrative adjudication. Administrative adjudication. And that's A-D, and then just phonetic it, figure it out, like adjudication, okay? And really what they're saying is, so if I'm a person that works for, say, the Environmental Protection Agency, in what ways, when I'm enforcing law, like when I'm enforcing the Clean Air Act, how do I kind of get to act like a lawmaker, and how do I kind of get to act like a judge, okay? This is addressing that idea from the sense that maybe Congress or the President don't want that, okay? So if you think about the fact that I'm enforcing that law, well, if laws are really vague or laws are kind of general, then that does give a bureaucrat a little bit more discretion because they can decide how they're going to enforce that policy. Okay? So, for example, if you think about the policy, give me a policy in the school, like a school policy.
Dress code.
Okay, dress code. All right. So we have a pretty specific dress code, right? But there is a little bit of wiggle room sometimes in terms of how we're going to enforce that or what we're going to do about that. Some teachers are going to be super strict. They're going to follow the letter of the law. Others might go, you know what, here, I'm going to approach it from this perspective or whatever. And some are just going to be kind of flippant about it. So we each have principals that supervise us. So mine is Dr. Maisie. So if you guys are in here and she comes in here and she's going to do an observation of me, and I've not enforced the dress code policy correctly, then she could actually dock me on my teacher evaluations, right? But I will say that she trusts me to be a professional, so that's probably not the reason she comes in here. But if you've got a teacher that's really not being a professional and they're not enforcing the policies and they have concern, then they might check up on them more, right? Because they're trying to take their discretion away. They're trying to control their discretion because they don't trust them as a bureaucrat to do what they're supposed to do, okay? So that's really what this is getting at. So when you look on the screen, we talked about this last class, but I wanted to revisit it. These are the ways that Congress can take away a bureaucrat's discretion. So there's your table. Just look over it really quickly and see if you understand. How is Congress controlling what bureaucrats do with each of those? So y'all just look and talk real quickly and then ask me if you have any questions. Maybe we need to do an example of each of these. Okay, so let's go through. I'm going to do the first example because I don't expect you to already know this, but the others, I think you should be able to think of examples. So when you look at this one right here, it says Congress can destroy, reorganize, or restructure. Last class when we went through the 3 different parts of the bureaucracy, remember I told you that the cabinets, that they're subject to some kind of congressional control. So after 9/11, W created the Office of Homeland Security, which is part of the EOP. Congress said that needs to be a cabinet. We need to elevate that to cabinet status, but we're going to take some of the existing agencies that are under the Department of State or the Department of Defense, and we're going to move them. And we're going to make them be part of Homeland Security because we want those agencies to talk to one another and share their intel and share their information. So right there, Congress is controlling the direction of that bureaucratic agency because they're saying your agency has to cooperate with that other part within that cabinet office. Okay? All right, so somebody tell me how Congress can exercise its oversight function and how that would check the bureaucracy. Thanks, Gracie. Give me an example.
Like, is it like how you said if a law is not super specific, like the bureaucracy would try to do like what it wanted with it, but then they can check them to make sure they're not just doing whatever they want?
They do check them. What is legislative oversight? Like, what is the oversight function? Like, what would they do? Do you know?
I mean, the only one I can think of is whenever they like confirm presidential appointments.
Okay, so that's totally true. So when they confirm presidential appointments, they have a hearing. So that person will come in and they'll have to testify. So you guys might remember, like earlier in the presidential election season, when Hillary Clinton had to go and testify before the Senate, and they were having those Benghazi hearings. So when she had been Secretary of State, there were some things that went on at our embassy in Benghazi, and they were questioning it. So she had to testify for like 13 or 14 hours before the Senate, where they questioned her over and over. That's legislative oversight. Congress can, like the courts, they can basically subpoena somebody from the executive branch. So any bureaucrat, any person that's in the EOP, like anybody that works in the executive branch can be called to testify. So like at its extreme, that would be the McCarthy hearings, Watergate, the Iran-Contra scandal, things you maybe learned about in history that were really scandalous, but it happens all the time, especially since Watergate. It's just become a very effective tool that Congress has because they're an extension of us. So it's like us getting to question the executive branch. Okay, Congress uses its budgetary powers. If Congress holds the purse strings and they want to control the direction of an agency, then they can use the budget to do that, right? And if they don't like the direction they're going, they can take their money away. So it's kind of a big deal. What does the word statute mean? Law. Congress passes the law. Pretty difficult to find a way around that. If the law says blank, then a bureaucrat has to do that. That's what that law says. There are some policies in Frisco ISD that like I don't necessarily agree with. Like they wouldn't be a policy I would put in place. Like it doesn't make sense to me. That being said, I don't possess law-making power. So when a policy is very black and white, I as a bureaucrat don't have a lot of choice. That is what I'm supposed to do. And then if I violate it, then I could suffer the consequences because that could actually affect my job. All right, and then the confirmation process is like the one that Gracie said earlier because they can decide. So all of these people right now that President-elect Trump is saying this person might be Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense or Attorney General, the Senate still gets to confirm them. So if you're at odds with the Senate, then they definitely can affect the direction of the bureaucracy. And most presidents president-elects don't get all of their nominations confirmed. I mean, that would not be unheard of. Okay, on our next screen, we've got how can the president control them. Now remember, the president is their boss. Everybody that works in the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, technically does account to the president. But the scope is very large, and the president's super busy, and they cannot have their hands involved in every single thing. Several of those things are just the fact that the president is the president. And like him or not, there is a certain level of power that goes along with that. That institutionalized presidency, when a president walks in the room, people are going to treat them differently. Here's a good example. President Obama said some not very complimentary things on the campaign trail about Donald Trump. But when Donald Trump came into the Oval Office as president-elect and they met, he showed him respect. And there was a level of dignity. And it went the other way as well, right? Like, excuse me, Donald Trump has said some horrible things about President Obama. But in that office, because they are going to share that office, there is a level of dignity and respect that just comes along with that. And that's the institutionalized presidency. Patronage. What does the word patronage mean? Anybody?
Giving a job to someone.
Giving a job to somebody you know. It's appointing your friends. This is not the patronage of the good old days like corruption and buying jobs. This is simply appointing your friends. Many of you have jobs because of patronage, like your friends helped you to get that connection or that job. No? Some of you do, some of you don't. Okay. Did you get him a job? Awesome. The president can use the appointment process. Donald Trump is doing that right now. He is appointing people who he thinks will be like-minded, people who will help to set the tone for what his cabinet and his EOP is going to look like. And then finally, executive order. I think we covered this last class, but let's go over it again because it's super important. What's an executive order?
A convening can't slash.
Yeah, so that was a real famous example. There are like over 15,000 on record. They're for everything, you guys. But what is it?
It carries the weight of law, but it isn't a law.
Yeah, which sounds so weird, right? So it's when the president just says, do blank, do X. And typically that's an order to the bureaucracy. So another example would be when President Truman was in office, our military was segregated on the basis of race. And before Brown and all that kind of stuff, he issued an order as commander-in-chief and said you must integrate the military. That was an executive order. So he's telling the bureaucracy, the Department of Defense, all of these military agencies, you need to integrate your troops. And he gets to do that because he can provide direction for them. Okay? All right, so are we good with that part? All right, the last couple things that I wanted us to look at right here. 3 points to remember, okay? Our first point says bureaucracy is an inevitable consequence of complexity and scale. Those of you that don't work for the government but you go to work for corporations, like any kind of large corporation, they all have this idea of bureaucracy. They all have this idea of scale. The broader your scope and the larger your size, the more compartmentalization that you're going to have. Bureaucrats naturally take an agency point of view. So what agency point of view means is that you think about it from your perspective rather than the broad perspective. Like I told you last class, that I tend to think of Centennial High School in terms of social studies education rather than the broad education. While I realize that science is important, it's just not kind of on my radar because that's not under the scope of my authority. Okay? And then, although agencies are subject to oversight, they do have considerable power in their own right, which is why many people refer to them as a fourth branch of government, though they are not necessarily. Okay? And I feel like we are finally getting this, but we've completed this now. So hopefully iron triangles are making more sense to you. I know in the beginning when we talked about it, it probably seemed a little bit odd because we talked about them with interest groups, but I keep bringing them up because it's such an important part of this. If you think now about that relationship and you understand how specialized and compartmentalized people can become in terms of policy, interest groups have a narrow policy focus. Members of Congress, when re-elected, tend to get a narrow policy focus because they tend to specialize based on committees. That's where all the work happens. And then bureaucrats, the same, right? Because they focus on a particular area of policy. And that's what lends them then to using their tools to kind of benefit one another. Okay. All right, I'm going to give you guys, say, 3, maybe 5 minutes to look at the questions on the back of your sheet in the front. Make sure we've got everything cleared up. If you have any questions of me, we can ask them, and then we're going to take our check over bureaucracy.